Okay, we talk about the nervous system. Animals, and specifically anything other than a sponge, have a nervous system of some sort. But there are all sorts of other things in the world that don't have nervous systems. So if you think that a bacteria or a plant enjoys Mozart, well, I don't know. I just don't think so. But either way, they still respond to their environment. Almost everything that's alive responds to their environment chemically. Plants, in addition to chemistry, respond in terms of the sun, phototaxis. Sometimes when plants get invaded, let's say by an insect, they actually release chemicals because they have an immune response. It's not an adaptive one. But they release chemicals that all other plants pick up on and ramp up their immune systems before they actually get infected. So, animals. The simplest nervous system that we find in animals is in the cnidarian, like jellyfish and sea anemones. And they have what's called a neural net. So they don't really have a central nervous system. They just have a network of neurons that are all connected together. These neurons are surprisingly conserved. Many of the same proteins for our neurons are found in them. In fact, one of the first neuron animals that we use to look at and learn about neurons is in squid. They have this very large axial neuron. And the whole way that neurons take chemical signals and transfer them to the next neuron, exactly the same. Sensory neurons. You don't have to think about these. A signal comes in. I'll give you an example. Moths, M-O-T-H-S, with wings. A lot of them have what are called ears. They're tympanic membranes along their sides. You think, why do they have those? Well, bats love moths. And one way for a moth to determine if it's being targeted by echolocation is that these things vibrate in response to high-frequency ultrasound. So if bat is far away, it and doesn't quite know it's there, then it kind of flies away, and no harm done. However, let's say it gets really close. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, so here are sensory neuron, right? It's connected to an interneuron. These are the neurons that carry signals from place to place. Sometimes they carry them all the way up to the brain, others to, let's say, motor neurons. And with this tympanic membrane, which is attached to a sensory neuron, it actually carries it until you get to a motor neuron, which is attached to a muscle. And it signals the muscle to do something without the animal having to think. The bat is closing in. you don't want to sit there and think, what should I do? And what's happened is that the signal comes in to the motor neuron and discombobulates it and the muscle. And the muscle doesn't act normally in terms of flight. In fact, it makes everything go random. And the moth starts tumbling and flying randomly in a way that's difficult for a bat to actually track. And oftentimes tumbles away and out of view. And it's actually a response to predation by a bat. Okay. Now there are reflex responses, of course, knee tap, painful stimuli, touch a stove, salivation, Pavlov's dog, you get exposed to, well, you walk in, your mom's cooking something really good, and you just, you start salivating. I mean, you almost got to just stick something in your mouth or you're drooling all over the place. So, in this case, these are automatic responses. You don't have to think about them. If a monster came in here, you wouldn't think, what should I do? It would automatically interact your flight and fight response. Your body would be drenched in adrenaline, all these other chemicals. You might run, you might hide and cower or whatever. You're not thinking then, you want an automatic response. And then the effectors, like a muscle, glands, whatever it is, this is the stuff that performs the desired response. So what you have here is a stimulus response. The monster coming in. The stimulus is the visual cue of the monster. Then all those neurons carrying that signal everywhere. And then something you do, okay? So there's two parts of the nervous system. The central nervous system, that's our brain and spinal cord. So a jellyfish doesn't have this. They have a neural net. But insects do, crustaceans, mollusks, all kinds of different things have essentially a central nervous system. And then peripheral nerves that go throughout our body. We've got nerves everywhere. Now, you might actually, but not the same everywhere. So if I was to take a little stick and rub it along, let's say, somewhere in your back, you'd be able to feel it, but not the same way as with your fingers. The number of neurons that can sense things is extraordinarily dense for your fingertips, and not necessarily elsewhere. Since we're vertebrates, we have a vertebral column and a spinal cord. We have this skull, obviously, the meninges, which is this layer that kind of protects the brain, and then this blood-brain barrier so that only very specific things can actually get across it into the brain. That's why the brain actually needs glucose. You can't get something like a disaccharide like sucrose through it. It doesn't work. It also, of course, stops all these things from entering, including bacteria, all kinds of different things. So it's a bunch of capillaries. These are the smallest vessels. And they create kind of an impermeable membrane. That's why it's great because it protects you, but if you're trying to get a chemical into the brain that normally it can't get through the blood-brain barrier, it might help, but there's no way to do anything about it. Actually, you can put it in through the spinal fluid. But in general, it's much harder to get stuff into the brain for treatment than it is other things. The brain stem. These are all automatic things. Breathing, swallowing, heartbeat, all that kind of stuff. Homeostasis means keeping the systems running in the same way. Temperature. Thalamus, it's a relay center for sensory information deep down in the brain. The hypothalamus controls, it's kind of sex drive, pleasure, pain, hunger, thirst. Kind of the limbic system, which is kind of in reptiles or in vertebrates, kind of the primitive brain. And then it's got right here here. That's the cerebellum. This is the limbic system. And then this is the neocortex, but let's go on. So when someone has a brain injury and there's brain death, that means there's no signs of brain activity. In other words, the brain is dead. Depending on how much damage, the person can go on like that for a long time. That's why you can keep people alive by putting them on a heart-lung machine or whatever. That's the whole idea between pulling a plug. A coma, there's brain activity, but if there's no brainstem damage, you don't need a respirator. They can still breathe. A lot of people come out of comas just fine. Sometimes they put people into comas to actually save them. So this is what a neuron looks like. At one end, you have the dendrite. They receive electrical signals from the next neuron coming in. They receive what's called neurotransmitters. Serotonin, dopamine, glutamate, all kinds of different things. It's the cell body. And then these signals are actually transmitted, they're electrochemical, to the terminal axis, which then, as we'll see, release these neurotransmitters from vesicles to the next neuron down the line. This neural impulse, it requires a certain amount of energy. So obviously we don't want our neurons firing all the time. There has to be enough of a stimulus to actually carry the signal. And it's all with sodium and potassium ions. So it's a electrochemical signal. And these are different ion channels, by the way, each of these. Okay. This is the whole idea about the myelin sheath that I talked about with multiple sclerosis. It protects the nerve all the way along. They're called Schwann cells. And they protect the neuron and they help prevent, let's say, any leakage of the electrical signal from leaking out. So there's gray matter, which is unmyelinated axons, and myelinated axons as well, which have the Schwann cells on them. This is the thing with multiple sclerosis. It actually mounts an attack and destroys these Schwann cells, and then you have problems with leakage and all kinds of neurological problems. There's actually some new work being done on fixing this. One thing I didn't mention is I mentioned about the gut bacteria. Well, sometimes we get what's called an infection called it's Clostridium. It usually happens because we take antibiotics, it wipes out the immune system. I mean, our gut bacterium, and this other bacterium comes in and actually takes over and causes intestinal distress, and it's very, very hard to treat. In fact, a lot of times it's almost, you can't treat it. Well, someone decided that maybe if we took a bacteria from someone else's gut and put it in, maybe from a normal gut, that would help. And it does. It's called a fecal transplant. Exactly what it is. Drink this. Okay. And it works. Amazing how these people with this disease, I mean, they were wasting away, and then their gut is reconstituted and they're all better. Okay. Now, what does this have to do with multiple sclerosis? Well, I mentioned about the fact that this microbiome in our gut is not just for digestion. In fact, it's the center for training our immune system on what's self and what's not self. Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease. It attacks the Schwann cells. There's a guy in Australia, mostly anecdotes. I don't know of a study, I think they're doing studies now, where he went in and he did a fecal transplant on someone and replaced their gut bacteria, and it mitigated. All of a sudden this immune response went off. So they were not suffering any more damage. Now they've got some new drugs that are working. Before there was nothing, okay? So this whole idea, interplay between here and our immune response and all kinds of autoimmune diseases, it's very kind of complex, but pretty interesting how it works. That's why I said eat dirt. Now, you can treat MS. There's these new therapies where, remember, you've got the myelin Schwann cells. They have little proteins, right, receptors on them, and that's what's actually attacked by the immune system. And in this case, you can use things that distract the immune cells by having them go after something else besides the myelin antigen. Stem cell replacement. Replace the defective immune cells in the bone marrow. No one's done that very well. And perhaps replacing the myelin shells as well with stem cell therapy, but hasn't really worked. We'll see what happens. Okay, so the neurons, as I mentioned, they propagate depending on if there's enough of a stimulus, in other words, action potential, all the way down. And then they release these neurotransmitters right across this inner barrier, and they're picked up by these dendrites here. So this is actually what it looks like. You have all these vesicles with neurotransmitters. As I mentioned, glutamate, serotonin, dopamine, all kinds of different things. They're released across, and then to the other side, they're picked up by here, and the then there's postsynaptic neuron. That's the synapse is right in between, right? This area. And then the impulse is propagated down to the next neuron. A lot of the diseases that we have are problems of neurotransmitters. In fact, a lot of the diseases of mental health are neurotransmitters diseases. As I mentioned earlier, let's say you have an antidepressant like Effexor or Prozac or whatever. What that does is it actually prevents the uptake in the postsynaptic part of uptaking serotonin. So it blocks serotonin uptake. And that's how it works. It makes that's the effect. Unfortunately, these antidepressants, they inhibit uptake in all neurons that uptake serotonin, and in equal amounts. Unfortunately, in the brain, a lot of nerve cells produce serotonin and take it up, but in different amounts. In fact, in a lot of ways, the neurotransmitter is actually changed a little bit depending on where it is. So you can see that it might help a person in terms of antidepressive effect, but it also might have a whole bunch of problems in terms of side effects. So Prozac, Zoloft, all these, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It actually inhibits the uptake of, in this case, serotonin that's been released here. Let's see. Okay. Now, what happens is these drugs stored, some drugs cause release of stored neurotransmitter, right? Like MMDA or LSD, all that kind of stuff. That's why they work. But what happens is the drugs like Zoloft and stuff, these little neurotransmitter bubbles right here, they actually release a chemical that sticks so that no more can actually be taken up. MMDA, ecstasy, it works on the serotonin system. LSD does too. Now other things work on the dopamine system. ADD has to do with usually, I think there's an excess of dopamine, and so they actually treat it the same way. They put a dopamine inhibitor that inhibits the uptake of dopamine, like Ritalin. Okay. So normally the reuptake dopamine limits the signaling, right? Ritalin inhibits the reuptake of dopamine. And so the dopamine stays longer in the synapse. And it actually stimulates the neurons because dopamine sometimes makes you sleepier. Now, they work because they fit into these receptors. In fact, our brain is full of what I would call opioid receptors. That's why opium and all that. Well, our brain is full of, actually, our body makes substances that are like opioids, like what are they? Hypoglandins or something like that. That's why a lot of, let's say you get in an accident, you don't feel all the pain. Okay? Cocaine works in the same sort of way. Okay? It inhibits dopamine reuptake. Why are drugs addictive? Immediate, euphoric, short duration, doesn't tell you much. LSD is like that, but it's not addictive at all. It can induce tolerance withdrawal. Opioids are a good example, but there's a lot of other ones as well. Methamphetamine. There's an epidemic going on in this country with methamphetamine users. You can usually recognize them because their faces are melting. Okay, so you know their faces are melting. And also they start acting strangely like they're afraid someone's out to get them, and they probably are. So they do this by neurotransmitter signaling. And that's why you use drugs that are used to treat mental health disorders like schizophrenia. In fact, that's why a lot of people who are depressed or schizophrenic are actually self-medicating. Serotonin drugs like MMDA, LSD, SSRIs, dopamine, Ritalin, cocaine, meth. What's this? Oh, we're on to this. Okay. I mentioned earlier that parasites, including pathogens, what's the thing that's most important? They have to get transmitted from one host to another. It's a difficult thing to do. Well, there's so many that actually infect the brain and cause the host to go and transmit it more effectively. So this honeybee collapse disorder, it looks like there's this, I think it's a fungus that infects their brain and they can't find their way back. But like rabies, rabies is only transmitted bodily fluids, but like dogs that have it, or other animals, it makes them want to bite other things and transmit it that way. Humans too, who get it as well. They don't last for long. There's actually a lot of parasites that take over the mind. Now, anybody in here have cats? No cat lovers? Oh, good, you're all safe. Okay. This is a eukaryotic parasite, and it has a life cycle. We'll take a look at it really quick. It has a whole bunch of different hosts, almost any warm-blooded animal. However, the primary host is the cat. It's the only place where they can actually reproduce sexually, in the gut of a cat. Now, animals that come into contact with cat feces can become infected with this. And the infection really is usually not all that serious. In fact, a lot of people in this country have it. Oftentimes, it's in our brain, but there's a little cyst that encapsulates it. Our immune system has kind of walled it off so it doesn't do anything. But these mice, the toxo can actually reproduce in their heads asexually, and they take over the mice's behavior. Mice are suddenly attracted to cat odor. Instead of running like they should, they think, oh, I love pussycats. Okay? And also they have slow reaction times. And all of a sudden, you have what's called kitty cat suicide. Like some people get cop suicide the same way. Because not only are they attracted to kitty odors, but it acts like an aphrodisiac. So they want to have sex with a cat. Now, I always say it's probably not a good idea to mix sex and death at the same time, but it's one way to do it. So how does it actually works on the dopamine process? T. gondii, the parasite, actually carries the genes that are required to synthesize dopamine. Dopamine can infect neural mammalian cells and increase the dopamine levels. It can travel through the blood-brain barrier, by the way. Oh, okay, so anyway, the dopamine is, and the dopamine is also, that's also part of the, well, it's something that makes people feel good. And it's tied in with sex drive and stuff like that. Oh, toxo is usually not a serious threat. It can be transmitted between immunocompromised people or a fetus because of proper handling of cat box. But there's also some evidence now that, in fact, it can affect human behavior. Of course, how do we know that if we're being affected? You know, it's kind of like, well, I guess someone else could say you're infected, and sometimes I do really strange things. Maybe it's T. gondii, I don't know. The first guy who actually came up with it was a Czech researcher who felt like at a certain point he started acting strange, and he wanted to know why. And he started thinking about this, and he was kind of the first one to suggest that maybe it's T. gondii infection. And remember I said these things they're very, very microscopic and they get encysted. But it could be like in mice, they start reproducing asexually. And looking at people who've been infected, well, men tend to be more jealous, stubborn, and rule defiant, but they're already that way, so it's hard to say if there's much of a difference there. Women, it makes them more warm and outgoing, supposedly, but also more moralistic. Who knows? So and also it turns out men tend to get into car accidents. Men who are infected tend to get into car accidents a lot more, perhaps by road rage. I think we'll call it at that. I will finish in terms of hypotheses that might explain the correlation between, let's say, reaction time in mice and infection with toxo. Well, one of them is that, of course, it might affect reaction time. So how would you actually do this? Well, you just do a double-blind study, that's all. So, in fact, that's what they did. They actually looked at, they gave some mice toxo, some mice didn't, looked at reaction time, and then they found out, in fact, there is substantially longer reaction time. In terms of humans, you can't actually do experiments like that. So you're kind of limited in terms of what you can do. It's basically weak inference stuff. Looks like there might be up to 20% of the U.S. population is infected with T. gondii. That's a lot. I think, well, obviously cat owners for the most part. Does this make us less responsible for our quirks? I think so, maybe not. And what do you think? Now, there's also a question of whether schizophrenia might be caused at least some cases, by T. gondii. The onset is typically during adolescence. Often symptoms can be alleviated by drugs that decrease dopamine signaling. So you can see in terms of the genetic and environmental influences. So we've got dopamine, and perhaps early development, the genetic background, and stress might result in schizophrenic symptoms. But, and again, it's correlative at this point. Obviously, you can't necessarily do experiments on humans like we're getting better at correlations. People who are infected with T. gondii are more likely to be in traffic accidents. Than uninfected men, right? Well, I mean that's a hypothesis. We could certainly find that out by getting a bunch of people who are infected by T. gondii, people who are not, and then perhaps look at the number of traffic accidents they've been in. Now, the reason perhaps this correlation is there, and maybe causation, is that it's thought that maybe T. gondii is actually responsible for like risk-taking behavior, but men are already kind of inclined towards that anyway. So you really couldn't show, in fact, that it causes this.